The words were a brand, searing themselves into the stunned silence of the ballroom. "I'll marry the ugly one." I felt them more than I heard them, a physical blow that traveled from my ears to the pit of my stomach, where it coiled like a serpent of ice. The Duke of Greystone had spoken, and the world had stopped to listen. Before that moment, I had been perfecting the art of invisibility. It was a skill honed over a decade, a necessary defense mechanism cultivated under the careful, cruel tutelage of my stepmother, Lady Beatrice. My designated place at any social function was an alcove, a shadowed corner behind a wilting palm, or, as on this particular evening, a small, recessed window seat obscured by a heavy velvet curtain. Here, I could shrink myself, become one with the damask wallpaper, a creature of shadow and stillness. My world was the cool glass at my back and the small worn volume of Vitruvius's De Architectura clutched in my lap, its familiar weight a secret anchor in a sea of glittering hostility. From my hiding place, I had an excellent vantage point from which to observe the performance. My sister Clara was the star, of course. She was a vision in silk the color of a summer dawn, her laughter like a cascade of tiny silver bells. Men orbited her like planets around a sun, their faces upturned and hopeful. My father, Lord Ashworth, stood nearby, his shoulders stooped even in his fine evening coat, his gaze fixed on Clara with a kind of desperate pride. He never looked for me. Looking for me would require acknowledging my existence, and that would mean acknowledging his failure to protect me from the woman who now stood beside him, her smile a slash of predatory crimson. "A triumph, my dear Beatrice," a portly baroness gushed, fanning herself vigorously. "Clara will have a duke on her line before the season is out. And your other daughter?" The question hung in the air, a delicate poisoned dart. Beatrice's smile didn't waver. "Ilara has a more retiring nature," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "She prefers her books to company. We mustn't force a wildflower to become a hothouse rose, must we?" The implication was clear. I was a weed, a common thing unsuited for this gilded conservatory. I pressed my spine harder against the wall, wishing I could merge with the stone. I was not a wildflower. I was a blot, a smudge on the perfect portrait of their family. The defining act of humiliation, when it came, was swift and breathtaking in its informal cruelty. Beatrice had been engaged in a verbal sparring match with her rival, Lady Danbury, and had, for once, come out the worse. Her face was tight with fury, her eyes scanning the room for a target upon which to vent her spleen. Her gaze landed on the lumbering, flushed form of Viscount Hayes, a man whose fortune was as vast as his intellect was small. He had been trailing Clara all evening with the dogged persistence of a fly, and had just been deftly rebuffed. "Ah, Viscount," Beatrice trilled, her voice carrying across the parquet floor. "So sorry my Clara's dance card is full. But we cannot have you leaving empty-handed." She gestured grandly, a sweeping motion of her gloved hand toward my shadowed alcove. "As a consolation, perhaps you will accept the hand of my other girl. Consider it a party favor." A wave of tittering laughter rippled through the nearby guests. The Viscount, deep in his cups, squinted in my direction and let out a booming laugh. "The little brown mouse. What would I do with her?" "Oh, I am sure you would find a use," Beatrice replied, her eyes glittering with malice. Shame, hot and acidic, flooded my veins. My face burned, my hands grew numb around my book. I was no longer invisible. I was a spectacle, a joke, a thing to be bartered for a laugh. The Viscount took a lurching step forward, a drunken leer spreading across his face. "Well then, I'll take the little mouse." My breath hitched, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it, the final, unbearable degradation. I would be dragged into the light and handed over like a piece of unwanted chattel. And then the room changed. It was not a sound, but a cessation of it. The music faltered, the chatter died, the laughter caught in 100 throats. A presence had entered the grand ballroom, a weight that bent the very atmosphere around it. From the main archway, the Duke of Greystone advanced. He was a figure from a Gothic novel, taller than any man in the room, dressed in immaculate, severe black that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a masterpiece of cold sculpture. Duke Greystone, the reclusive duke, a man of almost mythical power and wealth, who had not been seen at a society event in 5 years. His arrival was not an entrance, it was an invasion. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept the room with an unnerving lack of interest. They passed over the glittering diamonds, the hopeful debutantes, the powerful lords. They passed over my radiant sister and my fuming stepmother, and then they stopped. They found my alcove, they found me. For a heartbeat, the world consisted only of his gaze. It was not pitying, not cruel, not curious. It was assessing. As if he were examining the structural integrity of a bridge, looking past the paint and ornamentation to the foundational stone. He saw the Viscount lurching toward me. He saw the triumphant smirk on Beatrice's face. He saw my father's averted eyes. He saw it all in a single, silent moment. "No," the Duke said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a shard of ice. "You will not." The Viscount froze, his mouth agape. Beatrice's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. Ignoring them, ignoring everyone, the Duke of Greystone crossed the floor. Each step was deliberate, measured, an earthquake in miniature. He did not look at anyone but me. He stopped directly before my alcove, blocking me from the horrified, fascinated stares of the entire party. He was a wall of black wool and unyielding strength. He looked down at me, his expression still unreadable. Then, he turned his head just enough for his voice to carry throughout the hall, a proclamation aimed at the world that had tried to erase me. "I'll marry the ugly one." The silence that followed was absolute, a ringing, deafening void. He had not called me plain, or quiet, or retiring. He had used their word, the ugliest word. He had taken their most vicious weapon and turned it back on them, a declaration of war disguised as a proposal of marriage. He had seen their cruelty and raised them an incomprehensible act of defiance. And I, the worthless, invisible Alara, was the battlefield on which it would be fought. I could do nothing but stare up at him, the forgotten book slipping from my numb fingers to land with a soft thud on the floor. The journey home was a blur of disjointed images and sounds. Beatrice's hissed fury, a venomous counterpoint to the clatter of the carriage wheels on the cobblestones. My father's suffocating silence. Clara's bewildered questions, which no one answered. I sat numbly, a ghost between them, the Duke's words still echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind. It was a prank. It had to be. A magnificent, cruel piece of theater designed to humiliate my stepmother, and I was merely the most convenient prop. Hope was a fool's game, a poison I had learned long ago to avoid. I would not drink it now. I would not. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. The next afternoon, a footman in the Greystone livery, a severe gray and black that seemed an extension of the Duke himself, arrived with a missive. It was not a letter, but a summons. An embossed card requesting my presence at Greystone Manor the following day at 2 o'clock. My stepmother snatched it from the silver tray, her face a thunderous mask. "This is absurd," she spat, her fingers crinkling the thick card. "He cannot be serious. It is a game." Yet, her eyes held a flicker of fear. The Duke of Greystone did not play games. The next day, I was sent in our second-best carriage, a silent admission from Beatrice that she could not afford to refuse the summons, no matter how galling. The drive to the estate was a journey into another realm. The city gave way to rolling hills, then to ancient forests that crowded the road, their branches like skeletal fingers. Finally, the gates appeared, wrought iron behemoths depicting scenes of stark geometric beauty. Greystone Manor itself was not a home. It was a statement. A Palladian masterpiece of clean lines, perfect symmetry, and cold, pale stone that seemed to have been quarried from the heart of winter. It was breathtaking. It was a fortress. It was exactly the kind of house I had dreamed of, studied, and drawn in the margins of my notebooks for years. I was met at the door by a housekeeper, A woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun and a surprisingly gentle gaze. "Miss Ashworth," she said with a small, formal nod. "I am Mrs. Gable. His Grace is expecting you in the library." She led me through halls of echoing marble and past portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax, old paper, and something else. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. The library doors were towering slabs of dark oak. He gestured toward a set of shelves on the far wall, where several large leather-bound folios lay open on a reading stand. 5 years ago, at the Royal Exhibition, a young woman stood before the architectural model of the new bridge. She pointed out to her father that the proposed ratio of the tension arch was flawed, that it would place undue stress on the western pier under maximum load. My heart stopped. I remembered that day, the press of the crowd, the grandeur of the exhibition hall. I had been 14. I had seen the flaw instantly, a dissonance in the mathematics of the structure that felt as jarring as a sour note in a symphony. My father had shushed me, embarrassed. "Leave the engineering to the engineers, Ilara." The chief architect, standing nearby, had overheard and given me a patronizing smile. Our meetings were always formal, always in the library, always chaperoned by the silent presence of Mrs. Gable, who would bring in tea and then retreat to a distant corner with her mending. But in that vast, quiet room, a strange kind of intimacy grew. He would ask my opinion on a blueprint, and he would listen, truly listen, to my answer, his head tilted slightly, his gaze intense. One afternoon, during a chaperoned walk through the starkly beautiful winter gardens, a sharp wind cut through my thin shawl. I shivered, trying to hide it. Without a word, the Duke shrugged off his own heavy wool greatcoat and draped it over my shoulders. It was immense, smelling of him, of winter air and old books and clean linen. The warmth was shocking, a profound and practical kindness that felt more significant than 1,000 flowery compliments. I had made a point about the acoustical properties of the Pantheon in Rome, referencing a detail from a rather obscure text he had sent me. He looked at me, a strange light in his deep-set eyes, and the corner of his mouth quirked upwards. It was not a smile. It was the barest suggestion of one, a fleeting disturbance on the stern landscape of his face, but it was so unexpected, so transformative, that it made my breath catch in my throat. In that instant, the severe, reclusive Duke looked almost boyish, and my heart gave a painful, unfamiliar lurch. The moment of deepest revelation came on a rainy Tuesday. The steady drumming of water against the tall library windows was a soothing rhythm. He was standing before the fireplace, where a single portrait hung, a young man with Alistair's features, but a carefree, laughing expression. He had never spoken of it, and I had never dared to ask. That day, he did. "My brother," he said, his voice lower and rougher than usual. "Juliet." He wanted to be an architect. He spoke of a boy who loved beauty above all else, who saw architecture as a form of poetry. And he spoke of the night the new Lyceum Theater, a building praised for its revolutionary, delicate design, collapsed during a gala performance. Julian had been in the stalls. He believed beauty could defy physics, the Duke said, his gaze fixed on the laughing face in the portrait, his own face a mask of old, unhealed grief. I learned that night that physics has no regard for beauty. It only has regard for truth, for integrity. And suddenly, I understood. His severity was not coldness, it was a shield. His obsession with structure and fact was not a lack of feeling, it was a memorial, a way of honoring his brother by demanding the integrity from the world that had been denied to him. It was a vow never to be fooled by a beautiful lie again. An impulse, sharp and overwhelming, moved me. I stepped forward and laid my hand gently on his forearm. It was a simple gesture, a breach of every protocol, but it felt as necessary as breathing. The muscle beneath the fine wool of his coat was rigid, coiled with tension. He did not pull away. The silence stretched, filled only by the rain and the crackle of the fire. Then, slowly, he turned his hand, and his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was brief, a whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a jolt of heat through my entire body. It was an acknowledgement, a connection forged in a shared understanding of loss and a reverence for truth. In that moment, standing beside him in the firelight, I knew with a terrifying certainty that I was no longer simply intrigued by the Duke of Greystone. I was falling in love with him. And the hope I had tried so hard to suppress was no longer a seedling. It was a vibrant, growing thing, its roots twined inextricably around my heart. My blossoming connection with the Duke was a seismic event in the small, controlled world of my family. For my sister, Clara, it was a source of endless, genuine confusion. "But what do you talk about?" she would ask, perched on the edge of my bed, her brow furrowed. "He's so severe. And you're so quiet." She wasn't being cruel. She simply could not comprehend a courtship that was not built on witty banter and stolen glances across a dance floor. For my father, it was a source of mute, anxious bewilderment. He would look at me at the dinner table with a sort of dazed wonder, as if I were a piece of drab furniture that had suddenly sprouted gold leaf. But for my stepmother, it was an intolerable affront. Beatrice had built her entire world on a strict hierarchy of value, and that hierarchy was predicated on conventional beauty, social charm, and ruthless ambition. My sudden, inexplicable rise threatened the very foundations of her reality. That I, the ugly one, the quiet, bookish burden she had so long despised, might soon hold a station far above her own, was a public and personal humiliation she could not bear. Her plans for Clara, her own social ascendancy, all of it was jeopardized by this bizarre twist of fate. She saw my growing confidence, the light that had begun to dawn in my eyes, and she decided, with the cold precision of a striking snake, that it had to be extinguished. Her attack was not long in coming. She did not resort to common gossip or public scenes. Her methods were always more insidious, more intimate. She chose to wield the pen, crafting a weapon of pure, distilled venom. I knew nothing of it until the silence began. My daily delivery of books from Greystone Manor stopped. A scheduled visit was cancelled with a terse, formal note delivered by a groom, not the Duke's personal footman. A week passed, then 10 days. The silence from the manor was absolute, a crushing, suffocating void. The fragile hope that had grown within me began to wither. The old, familiar voices of self-doubt returned with a vengeance. Of course it was a game. Of course he had grown bored. A man like that, with his intellect and power, what could he possibly see in me for long? The shared moments in the library, the warmth of his coat, the brush of his fingers. It had all been a fantasy, a brief, impossible dream from which I was now brutally awakening. The color of invisibility began to seep back into my world. The end, I thought, came one afternoon when Beatrice summoned me to her private sitting room. Her smile was one of triumphant pity. "My dear Alara," she began, her voice a purr of false sympathy, "I know this must be difficult for you. Men like the Duke, they have whims. You were a novelty, but such things pass." She patted my hand, her touch cold and reptilian. "I have taken the liberty of making alternative arrangements for you. Lord Pemberton has been looking for a new governess for his dreadful children. The country air will do you good. It is for the best. You will be out of sight, and we can all move on from this unfortunate episode." She was exiling me, sending me away to be a servant, to be forgotten completely. The cruelty of it was so profound, so complete, that I could not even summon the strength to protest. I simply stared at her, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. She had won. It was only much later that I learned the true nature of her campaign. She had written a letter to the Duke, a masterpiece of calculated evil disguised as the worried correspondence of a loving stepmother. In it, she had painted me as a creature of delusion and instability. She claimed my quietness was not shyness, but a sign of a weak and fanciful mind. She invented a sordid, secret affair with a stable hand on our country estate, a boy named Thomas, suggesting that my interest in the Duke was merely the latest obsession in a long line of inappropriate attachments. To add a touch of verisimilitude, she had forged a note, a desperate, semi-literate plea for a clandestine meeting, and signed it with my name. She had sought to poison his mind not by attacking my appearance, which she knew he cared little for, but by attacking the one thing he valued above all else, my integrity. She was trying to prove that I, too, was a beautiful lie, a flawed structure hidden behind a plain facade. She had underestimated her opponent. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, the same day I was meant to depart for the Pemberton estate. The Greystone crest on the envelope was no longer a source of hope, but of dread. It was addressed not just to me, but to my father, Lady Beatrice, and my sister Clara. We were all commanded to attend the Duke at his residence that afternoon. Beatrice was radiant, dressed in a victorious shade of emerald green. She believed she was being summoned to receive the Duke's thanks for her discreet warning, to formally end the connection and restore the proper order of the world. She squeezed my arm as we climbed into the carriage. "Do try not to weep, Alara. It's so unbecoming." The library at Greystone Manor was as I remembered it, yet the atmosphere was entirely different. The air was not calm, it was charged, heavy, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. The Duke was not standing by the fire. He was seated behind his enormous desk, a king on his throne. The desk was clear except for a single folded letter. He did not rise when we entered. He simply watched us, his face an impenetrable mask of granite. He gestured to the 4 chairs arranged before his desk. "Be seated." We sat, a miserable tableau. Beatrice, preening and confident. My father, anxious and confused. Clara, worriedly glancing from me to the Duke. And me, hollowed out and resigned to my fate. The Duke let the silence stretch, a tool of intimidation he wielded with masterful skill. Finally, he picked up the letter. "I received a piece of correspondence recently," he began, his voice dangerously low. "It concerns the character of Miss Alara Ashworth." Beatrice leaned forward, arranging her features into a mask of solemn concern. "Your Grace, if I may." "You may not," he cut her off without looking at her. A flicker of panic entered her eyes. "Well, he must have been dismissed." "They also," the Duke went on, his voice dropping another lethal octave, "took the liberty of examining some of the estate's financial records, as I was concerned about its general management." He slid a ledger across the polished surface of the desk. It fell open to a page filled with neat columns of figures. What they found, instead of a fictional lover, was a very real and systematic pattern of embezzlement. Funds transferred, over the course of 10 years, from the dowry of the late Lady Ashworth, a dowry intended for her daughter Alara, into a private account in London. An account, Lady Beatrice, belonging to you. The air left the room. My father stared at the ledger, his face turning a pasty white. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Beatrice looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face, a moment before so confident, crumpled. "Lies!" she shrieked, the sound raw and ugly. "This is a trick. She has poisoned you against me. The girl is a viper." The chaos was a maelstrom around me, but I felt strangely calm. The Duke's gaze found mine through the storm. His expression was no longer cold. It was fierce, protective, and filled with a burning anger on my behalf. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice cutting through Beatrice's hysterics, gentle but firm. "Alara, your turn." And with his words, something broke free inside me. The years of silence, of swallowing insults, of making myself small. I stood up, my spine straight, my hands steady. I looked at the woman who had tried to erase me, her face now a rictus of hate and fear. "You were wrong," I said, my voice quiet at first, but gaining strength with every word. "You thought my value was in my face or my silence. You never bothered to look any deeper." I took a step forward. "You called me a shadow, and for years I believed you. I tried to be nothing. But a shadow is only cast when something stands in the light. It wasn't my darkness you feared, Beatrice. It was my light, the one you could never extinguish." I spoke of the small cruelties, the constant dismissals, the slow, grinding erosion of a soul. I spoke not of the money she had stolen, but of the self-worth she had tried to thief. It was not a plea for sympathy, it was a judgment. When I finished, the room was silent save for Beatrice's ragged breathing. She was broken. utterly and completely defeated, not by the Duke's power, but by the truth she had so long denied. The Duke rose from his desk. "Lord Ashworth," he said, his voice now ringing with indisputable authority, "you will see to it that Lady Beatrice is removed from your house. She will be retired to that remote cottage in Northumberland you own. A small allowance will be provided for her subsistence, drawn from what remains of your own funds. This is to avoid a public scandal that would tarnish your daughter's name. It is more mercy than she deserves. If I ever see her in London again, or if she ever attempts to contact Alara, I will see her in Newgate Prison. Is that understood?" My father, his face a ruin of shame and remorse, could only nod. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Clara, tears streaming down her face, came to my side. "Alara," she whispered, taking my hand, "I am so sorry. I was so blind. I never saw." I looked at my sister, not with anger, but with a distant, weary pity. I squeezed her hand once, then let it go. The threat was gone. The prison of my past had been demolished. He leaned down and his lips met mine. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was deep and sure and full of meaning. It was the taste of truth, the feel of a solid foundation. It was the end of a very long winter and the beginning of everything. A year later, I stood on the wind-swept ridge overlooking Greystone Valley, my hand in Alistair's. The autumn wind whipped a strand of hair across my face, and he gently tucked it behind my ear. We were not looking at the valley, but at the half-finished structure rising within it. The Greystone Public Library and Institute for Applied Mechanics, my design. "The flying buttresses will need to be reinforced to account for the northern gales," I said, my voice confident, my mind already working through the calculations. "I trust your judgment," Alistair replied, his gaze on my face, not on the building. It was his constant refrain, a statement of faith that had become the bedrock of my new life. As the Duchess of Greystone, I had found not a cage of suffocating protocol, but a platform of astonishing freedom. Alistair cared nothing for the vapid rituals of high society. Our time was spent in the library, in architects' offices, on muddy construction sites. Our evenings were a continuation of the conversations we had begun over his desk, debates about aesthetics and engineering that lasted long into the night. He had not given me a new identity. He had given me the space to finally inhabit my own. Later that evening, we were in our library. What had once been his alone was now ours, my own books and drawings finding their place among his. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the portrait of his brother Julian. I often felt Julian's presence in our work, a silent, smiling approval of the structures we were building, structures born of both beauty and integrity. Alistair came to stand behind my chair, his hands resting on my shoulders.